Michael Jordan is the most documented athlete of the modern era, yet the deepest chapter of his story had never been told. When DNA testing traced his maternal line back through centuries of silence, the results connected him to a specific people, a specific civilization, and a history that no biography had ever reached. What the science found was not vague. It was precise, unexpected, and far more remarkable than anyone anticipated. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Michael Jordan's name needs no introduction. It crosses languages, generations, and borders in a way that few names in human history have managed. The silhouette is a logo. The number is retired across an entire league. The 6 championships, the 2 Olympic gold medals, the statistical record that defined an era, all of it has been examined, debated, and documented with an exhaustiveness that borders on obsession. Biographers have traced his childhood in Wilmington, North Carolina. Journalists have reconstructed every significant decision of his career. Documentarians have gone frame by frame through his greatest performances. By any measure, Michael Jordan is one of the most studied figures in modern American life. And yet the story of where he actually comes from had never been told. His known family history reaches back a few generations with reasonable clarity. He was born in Brooklyn in 1963, the 4th of 5 children, before his family returned to North Carolina, where he was raised. His parents, James and Dolores Jordan, provided the foundation of discipline and expectation that would shape everything that followed. But beyond that generation, and the 1 or 2 before it, the record thins. Names become uncertain. Locations become approximate. And then, like almost every African-American family that traces its roots through the antebellum South, the trail reaches a point where the documents stop entirely. That point is not a gap in the family story. It is a wall built by history. Slavery did not merely exploit people, it erased them. It stripped names, dissolved family units, and left behind administrative records that counted human beings as property rather than persons. For millions of families, the paper trail ends somewhere in the mid-19th century, at a plantation whose records either no longer exist or never recorded the names of the people who worked it. Jordan's family is no exception. Everything that shaped the deepest roots of his ancestry, the continent, the culture, the people, lay buried beneath that silence. It had never been excavated, not until science offered a tool that paper records could not. The wall that Jordan's family history runs into is not unique to him. It is the shared genealogical reality of tens of millions of African Americans, and understanding why it exists requires looking directly at what slavery did to the historical record. The 1870 federal census was the first to record Black Americans by name. That single fact carries an enormous weight. It means that for every African American family tracing its roots through the South, there is a hard boundary, a year before which their ancestors exist in official documents only as property if they appear at all. The census records from 1850 and 1860 that do reference enslaved people are known as slave schedules. They list individuals by age, sex, and a physical description. No names, no family relationships, no places of origin, a person's entire existence reduced to a tick mark in a column. The damage extended beyond census records. Birth registrations for enslaved people were rarely kept. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal standing, which meant no marriage records. When families were separated through sale, no document tracked where individuals went or what became of them. When enslavers died, estate inventories listed people alongside livestock and furniture. And when emancipation came, many free people took new surnames, sometimes those of former enslavers, sometimes names chosen freely, which further complicated the genealogical trail for descendants searching generations later. This was not accidental. The systematic denial of recorded identity was a mechanism of control. A person without a documented history is easier to own, easier to erase, and harder to reclaim. Genetic genealogy emerged in part as a direct response to this erasure. For communities whose written history was deliberately taken from them, DNA offered something the archives could not: evidence that survived inside the body itself, unchanged across generations, indifferent to the destruction of paper records. Autosomal DNA testing can reveal broad ethnic and regional composition. Mitochondrial DNA can trace the direct maternal line back thousands of years. When the paper trail ends at a plantation gate, the only remaining witness is biology itself. When the DNA results for Michael Jordan were analyzed, the first layer of findings addressed what geneticists call admixture, the proportional breakdown of ancestry across broad geographic regions. The composition results were not ambiguous. They pointed overwhelmingly toward West and Central Africa, consistent with what researchers would expect given Jordan's family roots in North Carolina and the documented patterns of the transatlantic slave trade. But within that broad finding, the regional detail carried its own significance. The results pointed strongly toward origins in the areas corresponding to present-day Nigeria and Cameroon, with additional markers consistent with the Congo Basin region. These were not random designations on a map. They represented the primary zones from which captive Africans were taken and shipped across the Atlantic during the height of the slave trade, feeding directly into the plantation economies of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. The correlation was historically precise. North Carolina received a significant portion of its enslaved population through the port of Charleston in South Carolina and through overland routes from Virginia. The captives who passed through those channels were drawn heavily from the West African coastal regions, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and the corridor from the Congo to Angola. Jordan's composition results mapped almost exactly onto those documented trade routes. Yet composition results, while informative, have a limit. They can identify regions. They can suggest broad ethnic affiliations. What they cannot do is name a people with precision. The West African coastal zone spans hundreds of ethnic groups, dozens of languages, and centuries of cultural distinction. Knowing that an ancestry originates in present-day Nigeria and Cameroon narrows the field considerably, but it does not close it. That required a different level of analysis. Mitochondrial DNA, unlike admixture testing, does not average across all ancestral lines. It follows a single thread, the direct maternal line, passing unchanged from mother to child across every generation. Where admixture gives a wide view, mitochondrial DNA gives a precise one. The composition results were the map. What came next was the address. Mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to child without interruption. A son receives it and carries it, but does not pass it on. A daughter receives it and passes it to her children in turn. This means that a person's mitochondrial DNA is identical to their mother's, identical to their grandmothers, and identical to the grandmother's grandmothers, stretching back in an unbroken line through every generation of women who came before. It does not blend with the father's genetic material. It does not average across ancestral lines. It preserves a single thread of identity across centuries. That thread, in Jordan's case, led somewhere specific. His mitochondrial DNA belongs to a haplogroup, a genetic family defined by a set of shared mutations accumulated over thousands of years that places his direct maternal ancestry firmly within a lineage associated with the Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria and the Republic of Benin. This was not a broad regional suggestion. Haplogroup analysis at this level of resolution does not point to a continent or even a country. It points to a people. The Yoruba are not a minor or obscure ethnic group. They are one of the largest in Africa, numbering over 40 million people today across Nigeria, Benin, and the diaspora they have built across the world. They speak a tonal language with a documented literary and oral tradition stretching back centuries. They built cities when most of the world was organized around villages. They developed one of the most sophisticated artistic traditions in human history, a philosophy of personhood and destiny, and a system of governance that managed complex urban populations long before European contact reshaped the continent. The haplogroup result did not suggest a vague connection to West Africa. It pointed to a civilization with a name, a history, and 40 million living descendants. For a man whose own legacy is built on precision, on the relentless narrowing of margins, on doing exactly what others could not, the DNA found the same quality in his origins. The maternal line did not lead to a region. It led to a people who had been building legacies of their own for a very long time. The Yoruba were among the most heavily trafficked people of the entire transatlantic slave trade. That fact is not incidental to Jordan's story. It is the mechanism that connects a civilization in southwestern Nigeria to a family in Wilmington, North Carolina. Between the early 17th century and the mid-19th century, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Of those, a significant proportion came from the coastal regions of West Africa that correspond today to Nigeria, Benin, and the surrounding areas, the precise zones that Jordan's DNA points toward. The primary ports of departure were Badagry, Lagos, and Wida, each of them processing tens of thousands of captives over the course of the trade's operation. From those ports, ships crossed to the Americas along routes that fed specific regional markets. The Carolinas received a documented and disproportionate share of captives from the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra, the two Atlantic zones that correspond most directly to Yoruba-speaking territories. The historical record of this is not speculative. Shipping manifests, port records, and plantation inventories from South Carolina and North Carolina document the origins of arriving captives with enough consistency to establish patterns. Researchers studying the African origins of American enslaved populations have traced the Yoruba presence in the Carolinas back to the earliest decades of large-scale enslavement in the region. The corridor from the Bight of Benin to the Carolina coast was among the most traveled in the entire history of the trade. What happened when those captives arrived was systematic and deliberate. Names were replaced, languages were suppressed, family ties were severed through sale. The Yoruba language, the Yoruba religion, the Yoruba system of personal identity, all of it was targeted for erasure because a person stripped of cultural memory is easier to control. 2 centuries of that process stood between Jordan's maternal ancestor and the name of the people she came from. The DNA crossed those 2 centuries in a single result. What it could not do was name her. That erasure held. What slavery could not fully destroy, it could not fully predict. Cultural memory is not stored only in documents. It lives in the way people raise their children, in the values they pass without naming them, in the standards they hold without explaining where those standards came from. The Yoruba brought specific things with them that no overseer could confiscate. Among the most documented is the concept of Ori, the Yoruba understanding of personal destiny, the idea that each individual carries an inner spiritual force that determines the ceiling of their potential, and that the work of a life is to align with it rather than resist it. This is not a vague philosophical notion. It was central to Yoruba cosmology, embedded in naming ceremonies, in prayer, in the way parents spoke to children about who they were expected to become. Excellence was not optional. It was the fulfillment of a sacred obligation. Traces of Yoruba cultural presence in the American South are documented by scholars of African American history. The Gullah Geechee people of the South Carolina and Georgia coast, one of the most studied African American communities in the country, retain linguistic and cultural elements with traceable West African, including Yoruba origins. Certain words, certain spiritual practices, certain communal structures survive the Middle Passage in forms that researchers have identified and mapped. They did not survive by accident. They survived because people carried them deliberately, passing them in private, teaching them in the spaces that slavery could not fully reach. North Carolina sits within the broader cultural zone where these survivals have been documented. The values that shaped African American communities in the region, discipline, communal expectation, the elevation of excellence as identity, carry echoes that scholars have connected to West African cultural frameworks, even when the specific names and origins had long been forgotten. Jordan grew up inside that inheritance without knowing its oldest source. The discipline his parents demanded, the competitive standard his community reinforced, the refusal to accept limitation, none of it originated in Wilmington. The Yoruba were building that culture long before Wilmington existed. Jordan is not alone in this discovery. He is one of millions. Genetic genealogy studies conducted over the past 2 decades have consistently found that a significant proportion of African Americans carry maternal or paternal lineages traceable to Yoruba-speaking regions of West Africa. The Yoruba were trafficked in such numbers across such a sustained period that their genetic presence in the African American population is among the most widely distributed of any single African ethnic group. For many people learning this for the first time, the result is not merely informational, it is a reclamation. The response to Yoruba ancestry results among African Americans has been documented and studied in its own right. Some have traveled to Nigeria to engage with living Yoruba communities. Some have begun learning the language. Some have connected with Yoruba cultural and spiritual institutions that have actively extended recognition to diaspora descendants. The Nigerian government and various Yoruba cultural organizations have, at different points, formally acknowledged the relationship between the Yoruba homeland and the African American communities whose ancestors were taken from it. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a recognition that the slave trade created a diaspora whose descendants have a legitimate historical and cultural claim to that connection. What Jordan's result represents in this broader context is not exceptional. It is emblematic. His maternal line leads back to the Yoruba, not because he is unique, but because the history that shaped him is shared by an enormous number of people who look like him, grew up near where he grew up, and carry the same invisible thread running back to the same part of the world. The meaning of that is still being worked out. DNA results have opened conversations about identity, belonging, and reparative justice that extend far beyond genealogy. Knowing the name of the people you descend from changes something. It does not restore what was taken, but it closes a distance that was created deliberately. That closure carries weight that is difficult to overstate. The science gave a name to a silence that had lasted 2 centuries. What people do with that name is a question still being answered. The maternal line is confirmed. The haplogroup is specific. The Yoruba connection is not a suggestion. It is what the science found, and it stands. But science has a boundary, and in Jordan's case, that boundary runs directly through the most personal part of this story. Mitochondrial DNA traces one line, the mother's mother's mother, stretching back in a single thread. It cannot speak to every ancestor. Jordan's full ancestry is a web of dozens of lines converging across generations, and the DNA that has been analyzed and reported captures only a portion of that complexity. The autosomal results point broadly to West and Central Africa, with the regional concentrations already described. Autosomal analysis loses resolution beyond 5 or 6 generations. The specific villages, the specific family names, the specific individuals who were taken, that level of detail is beyond what any current technology can recover. There is also the question of the paternal line. Jordan's Y chromosome ancestry, the direct male lineage passed from father to son, has not been subject to the same level of public documentation as his maternal haplogroup. What is known about African American paternal lineages in general is that European admixture, a direct consequence of the sexual violence and coercion that were endemic to slavery, appears in a significant percentage of results. Whether that pattern holds in Jordan's paternal line specifically remains outside the public record. What cannot be recovered by any means available is the name of the woman who carried his maternal haplogroup across the Atlantic. She existed. The DNA proves her existence. It carries her signature across 2 centuries with complete fidelity, but her name, her village, the year she was taken, the ship she crossed on, the plantation she arrived at, all of it was erased with the thoroughness that the slave trade applied to the identities of millions. The science brought the story as far forward as it can go. It confirmed the lineage. It named the people. It mapped the route, and then it stopped at the edge of a silence that no instrument, living or yet invented, can fully penetrate. What the DNA found in Michael Jordan's maternal line is not a footnote to his story. It is the foundation beneath it, a lineage that crossed the Atlantic under the worst conditions in recorded history, lost its name, its language, and the civilization it came from, and still passed something forward. Yoruba built empires before the country that made Jordan famous existed. That ancestry does not belong to one athlete. It belongs to millions who share the same broken and surviving thread. The erasure was deliberate. The survival was too.